Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State by Frederick Engles. Written March to May 1884. First published October 1884. Introduction. After Marx's death, in rummaging through Marx's manuscripts, Engels came upon Marx's Précis of Ancient Society, a book by progressive U.S. scholar Lewis Henry Morgan, published in London 1877. The Précis was written between 1880 and 1881 and contained Marx's numerous remarks on Morgan, as well as passages from other sources. After reading the Précis, Engels set out to write a special treatise, which he saw as fulfilling Marx's will. Working on the book, he used Marx's Précis and some of Morgan's factual material and conclusions. He also made use of many and diverse data gleaned in his own studies of the history of Greece, Rome, Old Ireland, and the ancient Germans. It would, of course, become The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, the first edition of which was published October 1884 in Hattingen, Zurich. Engels wrote The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State in just 2 months, beginning toward the end of March 1884 and completing it by the end of May. It focuses on early human history, following the disintegration of the primitive community and the emergence of a class society based on private property. Engels looks into the origin and essence of the state and concludes it is bound to wither away, leaving a classless society. Engels, quote, "Along with the classes, the state will inevitably fall. Society, which will reorganize production on the basis of a free and equal association of producers, will put the whole machinery of state, where it will then belong, into the museum of antiquity, by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe." Unquote. In 1890, having gathered new material on the history of primitive society, Engels set about preparing a new edition of his book. He studied the latest books on the subject, including those of Russian historian Maxim Kovalevsky. The 4th edition, Stuttgart 1892, was dedicated to Kovalevsky. As a result, he introduced a number of changes in his original text and also considerable insertions. In 1894, Engels' book appeared in Russian translation. It was the first of Engels' works published legally in Russia. Lenin would later describe it as, quote, "one of the fundamental works of modern socialism," unquote. Preface to the first edition, 1884. The following chapters are, in a sense, the execution of a bequest. No less a man than Karl Marx had made it one of his future tasks to present the results of Morgan's researches in the light of the conclusions of his own, within certain limits, I may say our, materialistic examination of history, and thus to make clear their full significance. For Morgan, in his own way, had discovered afresh, in America, the materialistic conception of history discovered by Marx 40 years ago, and in his comparison of barbarism and civilization, it had led him, in the main points, to the same conclusions as Marx. And just as the professional economists in Germany were for years as busy in plagiarizing capital as they were persistent in attempting to kill it by silence, so Morgan's Ancient Society received precisely the same treatment from the spokesmen of prehistoric science in England. My work can only provide a slight substitute for what my departed friend no longer had the time to do, but I have the critical notes which he made to his extensive extracts from Morgan, and as far as possible I reproduce them here. According to the materialistic conception, the determining factor in history is, in the final instance, the production and reproduction of the immediate essentials of life. This, again, is of twofold character. On the one side, the production of the means of existence, of articles of food and clothing, dwellings, and of the tools necessary for that production. On the other side, the production of human beings themselves, the propagation of the species. The social organization under which the people of a particular historical epoch and a particular country live is determined by both kinds of production, by the stage of development of labor on the one hand and of the family on the other. The lower the development of labor and the more limited the amount of its products, and consequently the more limited also the wealth of the society, the more the social order is found to be dominated by kinship groups. However, within this structure of society, based on kinship groups, the productivity of labor increasingly develops, and with it, private property and exchange, differences of wealth, the possibility of utilizing the labor power of others, and hence the basis of class antagonisms. New social elements which in the course of generations strive to adapt the old social order to the new conditions, until at last their incompatibility brings about a complete upheaval. In the collision of the newly developed social classes, the old society founded on kinship groups is broken up. In its place appears a new society, with its control centered in the state, the subordinate units of which are no longer kinship associations, but local associations. A society in which the system of the family is completely dominated by the system of property, and in which there now freely develop those class antagonisms and class struggles that have hitherto formed the content of all written history. It is Morgan's great merit that he has discovered and reconstructed in its main lines this prehistoric basis of our written history, and that in the kinship groups of the North American Indians he has found the key to the most important and hitherto insoluble riddles of earliest Greek, Roman, and German history. His book is not the work of a day. For nearly 40 years he wrestled with his material until he was completely master of it. But that also makes his book one of the few epoch-making works of our time. In the following presentation, the reader will, in general, easily distinguish what comes from Morgan and what I have added. In the historical sections on Greece and Rome, I have not confined myself to Morgan's evidence, but have added what was available to me. The sections on the Celts and the Germans are in the main my work. Morgan had to rely here almost entirely on secondary sources, and for German conditions, apart from Tacitus, on the worthless and liberalistic falsifications of Mr. Freeman. The treatment of the economic aspects, which in Morgan's book was sufficient for his purpose, but quite inadequate for mine, has been done afresh by myself. And finally, I am, of course, responsible for all the conclusions drawn, insofar as Morgan is not expressly cited. Preface to the 4th edition, 1891. The earlier large editions of this work have been out of print now for almost half a year, and for some time the publisher has been asking me to prepare a new edition. Until now, more urgent work kept me from doing so. Since the appearance of the first edition, 7 years have elapsed, during which our knowledge of the primitive forms of the family has made important advances. There was, therefore, plenty to do in the way of improvements and additions, all the more so as the proposed stereotyping of the present text will make any further alterations impossible for some time. I have accordingly submitted the whole text to a careful revision, and made a number of additions which, I hope, take due account of the present state of knowledge. I also give, in the course of this preface, a short review of the development of the history of the family from Bachofen to Morgan. I do so chiefly because the chauvinistically inclined English anthropologists are still striving their utmost to kill by silence the revolution which Morgan's discoveries have effected in our conception of primitive history, while they appropriate his results without the slightest compunction. Elsewhere, also the example of England is in some cases followed only too closely. My work has been translated into a number of other languages. First, Italian, 1885, then Romanian, in the Yasi periodical Contemporanal, September 1885 to May 1886, further, Danish, 1888, a French translation by Henri Ravet, based on the present German edition, is on the press. Before the beginning of the 60s, one cannot speak of a history of the family. In this field, the science of history was still completely under the influence of the 5 books of Moses. The patriarchal form of the family, which was there described in greater detail than anywhere else, was not only assumed without question to be the oldest form, but it was also identified, minus its polygamy, with the bourgeois family of today, so that the family had really experienced no historical development at all. At most, it was admitted that in primitive times there might have been a period of sexual promiscuity. It is true that in addition to the monogamous form of the family, 2 other forms were known to exist. polygamy in the Orient, and polyandry in India and Tibet. But these three forms could not be arranged in any historical order and merely appeared side by side without any connection. That among some peoples of ancient history, as well as among some savages still alive today, descent was reckoned not from the father but from the mother, and that the female line was therefore regarded as alone valid. That among many peoples of the present day in every continent, marriage is forbidden within certain large groups which at that time had not been closely studied. These facts were indeed known, and fresh instances of them were continually being collected. But nobody knew what to do with them, and even as late as E.B. Tyler's researches into the early history of mankind, etc., 1865, they are listed as mere quote-unquote curious customs, side by side with the prohibition among some savages against touching burning wood with an iron tool and similar religious mumbo-jumbo. The history of the family dates from 1861, from the publication of Bachofen's Mutterrecht, Mother Right, Matriarchate, editor's note. In this work, the author advances the following propositions. 1. That originally man lived in a state of sexual promiscuity, to describe which Bachofen uses the mistaken term heterism. 2. That such promiscuity excludes any certainty of paternity, and that descent could therefore be reckoned only in the female line, according to Mother Right, and that this was originally the case amongst all the peoples of antiquity. 3. That since women, as mothers, were the only parents of the younger generation that were known with certainty, they held a position of such high respect and honor that it became the foundation, in Bachofen's conception, of a regular rule of women, gyneocracy. 4. That the transition to monogamy, where the women belonged to one man exclusively, involved a violation of a primitive religious law, that is, actually a violation of the traditional right of the other men to this woman, and that in order to expiate this violation or to purchase indulgence for it, the woman had to surrender herself for a limited period. Bachofen finds the proofs of these assertions in innumerable passages of ancient classical literature, which he collected with immense industry. According to him, the development from heterism to monogamy and from mother right to father right is accomplished particularly among the Greeks as the consequence of an advance in religious conceptions, introducing into the old hierarchy of the gods, representative of the old outlook, new divinities, representative of the new outlook, who push the former more and more into the background. Thus, according to Bachofen, it is not the development of men's actual conditions of life, but the religious reflection of these conditions inside their heads, which has brought about the historical changes in the social position of the sexes in relation to each other. In accordance with this view, Bachofen interprets the Oresteia of Aeschylus as the dramatic representation of the conflict between declining mother right and the new father right that arose and triumphed in the heroic age. For the sake of her paramour, Aegisthus, Clytemnestra slays her husband, Agamemnon, on his return from the Trojan War, but Orestes, the son of Agamemnon and herself, avenges his father's murder by slaying his mother. For this act he is pursued by the Furies, the demonic guardians of mother right, according to which matricide is the gravest and most inexpiable crime. But Apollo, who by the voice of his oracle had summoned Orestes to this deed, and Athena, who is called upon to give judgment, the two deities, who here represent the new patriarchal order, take Orestes under their protection. Athena hears both sides. The whole matter of the dispute is briefly summed up in the debate which now takes place between Orestes and the Furies. Orestes contends that Clytemnestra has committed a double crime. She has slain her husband, and thus she has also slain his father. Why should the Furies pursue him and not her, seeing that she is by far the more guilty? The answer is striking. Quote, "She was not kin by blood to the man she slew." Unquote. The murder of a man not related by blood, even if he be the husband of the murderess, is expiable and does not concern the Furies. Their office is solely to punish murder between blood relations, and of such murders the most grave and most inexpiable, according to Mother Right, is matricide. Apollo now comes forward in Orestes' defense. Athena calls upon Areopagites, the Athenian jurors, to vote. The votes for Orestes' condemnation and for his acquittal are equal. Athena, as president, gives her vote for Orestes and acquits him. Father right has triumphed over mother right. The quote-unquote gods of young descent, as the Furies themselves call them, have triumphed over the Furies. The latter then finally allow themselves to be persuaded to take up a new office in the service of the new order. This new but undoubtedly correct interpretation of the Oresteia is one of the best and finest passages in the whole book, but it proves at the same time that Bahofen believes at least as much as Aeschylus did in Furies, Apollo, and Athena, for at bottom he believes that the overthrow of mother right by father right was a miracle wrought during the Greek heroic age by these divinities. That such a conception, which makes religion the lever of world history, must finally end in pure mysticism is clear. It is therefore a tough and by no means always a grateful task to plow through Bahofen's solid tome. But all that does not lessen his importance as a pioneer. He was the first to replace the vague phrases about some unknown primitive state of sexual promiscuity by proofs of the following facts: that abundant traces survive in old classical literature of a state prior to monogamy among the Greeks and Asiatics, when not only did a man have sexual intercourse with several women, but a woman with several men, without offending against morality. That this custom did not disappear without leaving its traces in the limited surrender, which was the price women had to pay for the right to monogamy. That therefore descent could originally be reckoned only in the female line from mother to mother, that far into the period of monogamy, with its certain or at least acknowledged paternity, the female line was still alone recognized, and that the original position of the mothers, as the only certain parents of their children, secured for them, and thus for their whole sex, a higher social position than women have ever enjoyed since. Bahofen did not put these statements as clearly as this, for he was hindered by his mysticism, but he proved them, and in 1861, that was a real revolution. Bahofen's massive volume was written in German, the language of the nation which at the time interested itself less than any other in the prehistory of the modern family. Consequently, he remained unknown. His first successor in the same field appeared in 1865, without ever having heard of Bahofen. His first successor was J.F. McLennan, the exact opposite of his predecessor. Instead of a mystic of genius, we have the dry-as-dust jurist. Instead of the exuberant imagination of a poet, the plausible arguments of a barrister defending his brief. McLennan finds among many savages, barbarian, and even civilized peoples of ancient and modern times a form of marriage in which the bridegroom, alone or with his friends, must carry off the bride from her relations by a show of force. This custom must be the survival of an earlier custom, when the men of one tribe did in fact carry off their wives by force from other tribes. What was the origin of this quote-unquote marriage by capture? So long as men could find enough women in their own tribe, there was no reason whatever for it. We find, however, no less frequently that among underdeveloped peoples there are certain groups which in 1865 were still often identified with the tribes themselves, within which marriage is forbidden, so that the men are obliged to take their wives and women their husbands from outside the group, whereas among other people the custom is that the men of one group must take their wives only from within their own group. McLennan calls the first peoples exogamous and the second endogamous. He then promptly proceeds to construct a rigid opposition between exogamous and endogamous quote-unquote tribes, and although his own investigation into exogamy forced the fact under his nose that in many, if not in most or even in all cases, this opposition exists only in his own imagination, he nevertheless makes it the basis of his whole theory. According to this theory, exogamous tribes can only obtain their wives from other tribes, and since in savagery there is a permanent state of war between tribe and tribe, these wives could only be obtained by capture. McLennan then goes on to ask, whence this custom of exogamy? The conception of consanguinity and incest could not have anything to do with it, for these things only came much later. But there was another common custom among savages, the custom of killing female children immediately after birth. This would cause a surplus of men in each individual tribe. of which the inevitable and immediate consequence would be that several men possessed a wife in common, polyandry, and this would have the further consequence that it would be known who was the mother of a child, but not who its father was. Hence, relationship was only in the female line, with exclusion of the male line, mother right. And a second consequence of the scarcity of women within the tribe, a scarcity which polyandry mitigated but did not remove, was precisely this systematic, forcible abduction of women from other tribes. Quote, as exogamy and polyandry are referable to one and the same cause, a want of balance between the sexes, we are forced to regard all the exogamous races as having originally been polyandrous. Therefore, we must hold it to be beyond dispute that among exogamous races, the first system of kinship was that which recognized blood ties through mothers only. Unquote. McLennan, Studies in Ancient History, 1886, Primitive Marriage, page 124. It is McLennan's merit to have directed attention to the general occurrence and great importance of what he calls exogamy. He did not by any means discover the existence of exogamous groups, still less did he understand them. Besides the early scattered notes of many observers, these were McLennan's sources. Latham, Descriptive Ethnology, 1859, had given a detailed and accurate description of this institution among the Indian Magyars, and had said that it was very widespread and occurred in all parts of the world, a passage which McLennan himself cites. Morgan, in 1847, in his Letters on the Iroquois, American Review, and in 1851 in The League of the Iroquois, had already demonstrated the existence of exogamous groups among this tribe and had given an accurate account of them, whereas McLennan, as we shall see, wrought greater confusion here with his legalistic mind than Bachofen wrought in the field of mother right with his mystical fancies. It is also a merit of McLennan that he recognized matrilinear descent as the earlier system, though he was here anticipated by Bachofen, as he later acknowledged. But McLennan is not clear on this either. He always speaks of, quote, kinship through females only, unquote, and this term, which is correct for an earlier stage, he continually applies to later stages of development, when descent and inheritance were indeed still traced exclusively through the female line, but when kinship on the male side was also recognized and expressed. There you have the pedantic mind of the jurist, who fixes on a rigid legal term and goes on applying it unchanged when changed conditions have made it applicable no longer. Apparently McLennan's theory, plausible though it was, did not seem any too well established, even to its author. At any rate, he himself is struck by the fact that, quote, it is observable that the form of capture is now most distinctively marked and impressive just among those races which have male kinship, unquote. In parentheses, should be, quote, descent in the male line, unquote. Ibid, page 140. And again, quote, it is a curious fact that nowhere now, that we are aware of, is infanticide a system where exogamy and the earliest form of kinship coexist, unquote. Ibid, page 146. Both these facts flatly contradict his method of explanation, and he can only meet them with new and still more complicated hypotheses. Nevertheless, his theory found great applause and support in England. McLennan was here generally regarded as the founder of the history of the family and the leading authority on the subject. However, many exceptions and variations might be found in individual cases. His opposition of exogamous and endogamous tribes continued to stand as the recognized foundation of the accepted view and to act as blinders, obstructing any free survey of the field under investigation, and so making any decisive advance impossible. Against McLennan's exaggerated reputation in England, and the English fashion is copied elsewhere, it becomes a duty to set down the fact that he has done more harm with his completely mistaken antithesis between exogamous and endogamous quote-unquote tribes than he has done good by his research. Facts were now already coming to light in increasing number, which did not fit into his neat framework. McLennan knew only three forms of marriage: polygyny, polyandry, and monogamy. But once attention had been directed to the question, more and more proofs were found that there existed among undeveloped peoples forms of marriage in which a number of men possessed a number of women in common, and Lubbock, The Origin of Civilization, 1870, recognized this group marriage, quote-unquote communal marriage, as a historical fact. Immediately afterwards, in 1871, Morgan came forward with new and in many ways decisive evidence. He had convinced himself that the peculiar system of consanguinity in force among the Iroquois was common to all the aboriginal inhabitants of the United States and therefore extended over a whole continent, although it directly contradicted the degrees of relationship arising out of the system of marriage as actually practiced by these people. He then induced the federal government to collect information about the systems of consanguinity among the other peoples of the world, and to send out for this purpose tables and lists of questions prepared by himself. He discovered from the replies, 1. That the system of consanguinity of the American Indians was also in force among numerous peoples in Asia and, in a somewhat modified form, in Africa and Australia. 2. That its complete explanation was to be found in a form of group marriage, which was just dying out in Hawaii and other Australasian islands. And 3. That side by side with this form of marriage, a system of consanguinity was in force in the same islands, which could only be explained through a still more primitive, now extinct, form of group marriage. He published the collected evidence together with the conclusions he drew from it in his Systems of Consanguinity and Affinity, 1871, and thus carried the debate onto an infinitely wider field. By starting from the systems of consanguinity and reconstructing from them the corresponding forms of family, he opened a new line of research and extended our range of vision into the prehistory of man. If this method proved to be sound, MacLennan's pretty theories would be completely demolished. MacLennan defended his theory in a new edition of Primitive Marriage, Studies in Ancient History, 1876. Whilst he himself constructed a highly artificial history of the family out of pure hypotheses, he demands from Lubbock and Morgan not merely proofs for every one of their statements, but proofs as indisputably valid as if they were to be submitted in evidence in a Scottish court of law. And this is the man who, from Tacitus' report on the close relationship between maternal uncle and sister's son among the Germans, Germania chapter 20, from Caesar's report that the Britons in groups of 10 or 12 possessed their wives in common, from all the other reports of classical authors on community of wives among barbarians, calmly draws the conclusion that all these people lived in a state of polyandry. One might be listening to a prosecuting counsel who can allow himself every liberty in arguing his own case, but demands from defending counsel the most formal, legally valid proof for his every word. He maintains that group marriage is pure imagination, and by so doing falls far behind Bachofen. He declares that Morgan's systems of consanguinity are mere codes of conventional politeness, the proof being that the Indians also address a stranger or a white man as brother or father. One might as well say that the terms father, mother, brother, sister are mere meaningless forms of address, because Catholic priests and abbesses are addressed as father and mother, and because monks and nuns, and even Freemasons and members of English trade unions and associations at their full sessions, are addressed as brother and sister. In a word, MacLennan's defense was miserably feeble. But on one point he had still not been assailed: the opposition of exogamous and endogamous quote-unquote tribes, on which his whole system rested, not only remained unshaken, but was even universally acknowledged as the keystone of the whole history of the family. MacLennan's attempt to explain this opposition might be inadequate and in contradiction with his own facts, but the antithesis itself, the existence of two mutually exclusive types of self-sufficient and independent tribes, of which the one type took their wives from within the tribe, while the other type absolutely forbade it, that was sacred gospel. Compare, for example, Girard Toylin's Origines de la Famille, 1874, and even Lubbock's Origin of Civilization, 4th edition, 1882. Here Morgan takes the field with his main work, Ancient Society, 1877, the work that underlies the present study. What Morgan had only dimly guessed in 1871 is now developed in full consciousness. There is no antithesis between endogamy and exogamy. Up to the present, the existence of exogamous quote-unquote tribes has not been demonstrated anywhere. But at the time when group marriage still prevailed, and in all probability it prevailed everywhere at some time, the tribe was subdivided into a number of groups related by blood on the mother's side, gentes, within which it was strictly forbidden to marry, so that the men of a gens, though they could take their wives from within the tribe and generally did so, were compelled to take them from outside their gens. Thus, while each gens was strictly exogamous, the tribe embracing all the gentes was no less endogamous, which finally disposed of the last remains of MacLennan's artificial constructions. But Morgan did not rest here. Through the gens of the American Indians, he was enabled to make his second great advance in his field of research. In this gens, organized according to mother right, he discovered the primitive form out of which had developed the later gens, organized according to father right, the gens as we find it among the ancient civilized peoples. The Greek and Roman gens, the old riddle of all historians, now found its explanation in the Indian gens, and a new foundation was thus laid for the whole of primitive history. This rediscovery of the primitive matriarchal gens as the earlier stage of the patriarchal gens of civilized peoples has the same importance for anthropology as Darwin's theory of evolution has for biology and Marx's theory of surplus value for political economy. It enabled Morgan to outline for the first time a history of the family in which for the present, so far as the material now available permits, at least the classic stages of development in their main outlines are now determined. That this opens a new epoch in the treatment of primitive history must be clear to everyone. The matriarchal gens has become the pivot on which the whole science turns. Since its discovery, we know where to look and what to look for in our research, and how to arrange the results. And consequently, since Morgan's book, progress in this field has been made at a far more rapid speed. Anthropologists, even in England, now generally appreciate, or rather appropriate, Morgan's discoveries. But hardly one of them has the honesty to admit that it is to Morgan that we owe this revolution in our ideas. In England, they try to kill his book by silence, and dispose of its author with condescending praise for his earlier achievements. They niggle endlessly over details and remain obstinately silent about his really great discoveries. The original edition of Ancient Society is out of print. In America, there is no sale for such things. In England, it seems, the book was systematically suppressed, and the only edition of this epoch-making work still circulating in the book trade is the German translation. Why this reserve? It is difficult not to see in it a conspiracy of silence. For politeness' sake, our recognized anthropologists generally pack their writings with quotations and other tokens of camaraderie. Is it perhaps because Morgan is an American, and for the English anthropologists it goes sorely against the grain that, despite their highly credible industry in collecting material, they should be dependent for their general points of view in the arrangement and grouping of this material, for their ideas, in fact, on two foreigners of genius, Bachofen and Morgan? They might put up with the German, but the American? Every Englishman turns patriotic when he comes up against an American, and of this I saw highly entertaining instances in the United States. Moreover, MacLennan was, so to speak, the officially appointed founder and leader of the English school of anthropology. It was almost a principle of anthropological etiquette to speak of his artificially constructed historical series, child murder, polygyny, marriage by capture, matriarchal family, in tones only of profoundest respect. The slightest doubt in the existence of exogamous and endogamous quote-unquote tribes of absolute mutual exclusiveness was considered rank heresy. Morgan had committed a kind of sacrilege in dissolving all these hallowed dogmas into thin air. Into the bargain, he had done it in such a way that it only needed saying to carry immediate conviction, so that the MacLennanites, who had hitherto been helplessly reeling to and fro between exogamy and endogamy, could only beat their brows and exclaim, "How could we be such fools as to not think of that for ourselves long ago?" As if these crimes had not already left the official school with the option only of coldly ignoring him, Morgan filled the measure to overflowing by not merely criticizing civilization, the society of commodity production, the basic form of present-day society, in a manner reminiscent of Fourier, but also by speaking of a future transformation of the society in words which Karl Marx might have used. He had therefore amply merited MacLennan's indignant reproach that, quote, "the historical method is antithetical to Mr. Morgan's mind," unquote, and its echo as late as 1884 from Mr. Professor Gerard Toylan of Geneva. In 1874, Origines de la Famille, this same gentleman was still groping helplessly in the maze of the MacLennanite exogamy from which Morgan had to come and rescue him. Of the other advances which primitive anthropology owes to Morgan, I do not need to speak here. They are sufficiently discussed in the course of this study. The 14 years which have elapsed since the publication of his chief work have greatly enriched the material available for the study of the history of primitive human societies. The anthropologists, travelers, and primitive historians by profession have now been joined by the comparative jurists who have contributed either new material or new points of view. As a result, some of Morgan's minor hypotheses have been shaken or even disproved. But not one of the great leading ideas of his work has been ousted by this new material. The order which he introduced into primitive history still holds in its main lines today. It is, in fact, winning recognition in the same degree in which Morgan's responsibility for the great advance is carefully concealed. Frederick Engles, London, June 16, 1891. Footnote. On the voyage back from New York in September 1888, I met a former member of Congress for the district of Rochester who had known Lewis Morgan. Unfortunately, he could not tell me very much about him. He said that Morgan had lived in Rochester as a private individual, occupied only with his studies. His brother was a colonel and had held a post in the War Department in Washington. It was through him that Morgan had managed to interest the government in his researches and to get several of his works published at public expense. While he was a member of Congress, my informant had also on more than one occasion used his influence on Morgan's behalf. End of footnote. Chapter 1. Stages of Prehistoric Culture. Morgan is the first man who, with expert knowledge, has attempted to introduce a definite order into the history of primitive man. So long as no important additional material makes changes necessary, his classification will undoubtedly remain in force. Of the three main epochs, savagery, barbarism, and civilization, he is concerned, of course, only with the first two and the transition to the third. He divides both savagery and barbarism into lower, middle, and upper stages, according to the progress made in the production of food, for he says, quote, "Upon their skill in this direction, the whole question of human supremacy on the earth depended. Mankind are the only beings who may be said to have gained an absolute control over the production of food. It is accordingly probable that the great epochs of human progress have been identified more or less directly with the enlargement of the sources of subsistence." Unquote. Morgan, Opus Citato, page 19. The development of the family takes a parallel course, but here the periods have not such striking marks of differentiation. 1. Savagery. A. Lower stage. Childhood of the human race. Man still lived in his original habitat, in tropical or subtropical forests, and was partially, at least, a tree dweller, for otherwise his survival among huge beasts of prey cannot be explained. Fruit, nuts, and roots served him for food. The development of articulate speech is the main result of this period. Of all the peoples known to history, none was still at this primitive level. Though this period may have lasted thousands of years, we have no direct evidence to prove its existence. But once the evolution of man from the animal kingdom is admitted, such a transitional stage must necessarily be assumed. Footnote. In 1880, the evidence for this was astoundingly scarce, yet Engels's conclusions, most importantly, not articulate, not modern, but not ape speech, remain correct to this day. Throughout the 20th century, groundbreaking new archaeological finds opened up our understanding of this period. These characteristics are descriptive of the first human genus, Australopithecus. The first fossil evidence was found in 1924 at Taung, South Africa, who came into existence 5 to 6 million years ago on the continent of Africa and became extinct in the early Pleistocene period, 1.6 million to 900,000 years ago. These humans primarily were dependent on fruits, roots, etc., but likely supplemented this as scavengers. They did not live in caves or dwellings of their own choosing, but were primarily jungle dwellers, likely residing in trees. B. Middle stage. Begins with the utilization of fish for food, including crabs, mussels, and other aquatic animals, and with the use of fire. The two are complementary, since fish becomes edible only by the use of fire. With this new source of nourishment, men now became independent of climate and locality. Even as savages, they could, by following the rivers and coasts, spread over most of the earth. Proof of these migrations is the distribution over every continent of the crudely worked, unsharpened flint tools of the earlier Stone Age, known as paleoliths, all or most of which date from this period. New environments, ceaseless exercise of his inventive faculty, and the ability to produce fire by friction led man to discover new kinds of food. Farinaceous roots and tubers, for instance, were baked in hot ashes or in ground ovens. With the invention of the first weapons, club and spear, game could sometimes be added to the fare, but the tribes which figure in books as living entirely, that is, exclusively by hunting, never existed in reality. The yield of the hunt was far too precarious. At this stage, owing to the continual uncertainty of food supplies, cannibalism seems to have arisen and was practiced from now onward for a long time. The Australian Aborigines and many of the Polynesians are still in this middle stage of savagery today. Footnote. Engels here describes the practices of Homo erectus, and again his conclusions are lucid despite the lack of much evidence in his 19th century. Collection of their own food was predominant. The use of fire is widely accepted. They hunted animals to some extent, and most importantly, these practices allowed for the migration of humanity. 1 million years ago, Homo erectus left Africa and settled in the Middle East, which was later the cradle of civilization. Not surprising considering it was the great crossroads of human migration, splitting up with the migrations from southern Europe to throughout southern Asia. The extent of the ice caps had not yet receded, so settlement of the northern regions was not yet possible. Engels does, however, make two mistakes in his conclusions. Cannibalism was very likely non-existent. Its practice in human history is questionable, and Polynesians and Australians are not Homo erectus, but Homo sapiens. In the footnote. C. Upper stage. Begins with the invention of the bow and arrow, whereby game became a regular source of food, and hunting a normal form of work. Bow, string, and arrow already constitute a very complex instrument, whose invention implies long, accumulated experience and sharpened intelligence, and therefore knowledge of many other inventions as well. We find, in fact, that the peoples acquainted with the bow and arrow, but not yet with pottery, from which Morgan dates the transition to barbarism, are already making some beginnings towards settlement in villages and have gained some control over the production of means of subsistence. We find wooden vessels and utensils, finger weaving without looms, with filaments of bark, plated baskets of bast or osier, sharpened Neolithic stone tools. With the discovery of fire and the stone axe, dugout canoes now become common. Beams and planks are also sometimes used for building houses. We find all these advances, for instance, among the Indians of Northwest America, who are acquainted with the bow and arrow, but not with pottery. The bow and arrow was for savagery what the iron sword was for barbarism, and firearms for civilization, the decisive weapon. Footnote. Characteristics descriptive of Homo sapiens, that is, modern human beings, who first emerged 100,000 years ago, and who very likely had their origins in Africa, It is thought that the Homo erectus became extinct throughout the world, and Homo sapiens emerged from the genus of Homo erectus that had survived in Africa. And in a footnote. 2. Barbarism. A. Lower stage. Dates from the introduction of pottery. In many cases it has been proved, and in all it is probable, that the first pots originated from the habit of covering baskets or wooden vessels with clay to make them fireproof, that the clay mold answered the purpose without any inner vessel. Thus far we have been able to follow a general line of development applicable to all peoples at a given period without distinction of place. With the beginning of barbarism, however, we have reached a stage when the difference in the natural endowments of the two hemispheres of the earth comes into play. The characteristic feature of the period of barbarism is the domestication and breeding of animals and the cultivation of plants. Now, the Eastern Hemisphere, the so-called Old World, possessed nearly all the animals adaptable to domestication and all the varieties of cultivable cereals except one. The Western Hemisphere, America, had no mammals that could be domesticated except the llama, which, moreover, was only found in one part of South America, and of all the cultivable cereals only one, though that was the best, namely maize. Owing to these differences in natural conditions, the population of each hemisphere now goes on its own way, and different landmarks divide the particular stages in each of the two cases. B. Middle stage. Begins in the Eastern Hemisphere with domestication of animals, in the Western with the cultivation, by means of irrigation, of plants for food, and with the use of adobe, sun-dried bricks and stone for building. We will begin with the Western Hemisphere, as here this stage was never superseded before the European conquest. At the time when they were discovered, the Indians at the lower stage of barbarism, comprising all the tribes living in the east of the Mississippi, were already practicing some horticulture of maize, and possibly also of gourds, melons, and other garden plants, from which they obtained a very considerable part of their food. They lived in wooden houses in villages protected by palisades. The tribes in the northwest, particularly those in the region of the Columbia River, were still at the upper stage of savagery and acquainted neither with pottery nor with any form of horticulture. The so-called Pueblo Indians of New Mexico, however, and the Mexicans, Central Americans, and Peruvians at the time of their conquest were at the middle stage of barbarism. They lived in houses like fortresses, made of adobe brick or of stone, and cultivated maize and other plants, varying according to locality and climate, in artificially irrigated plots of ground, which supplied their main source of food. Some animals even had also been domesticated, the turkey and other birds by the Mexicans, the llama by the Peruvians. They could also work metals, but not iron, hence they were still unable to dispense with stone weapons and tools. The Spanish conquest then cut short any further independent development. In the Eastern Hemisphere, the middle stage of barbarism began with the domestication of animals, providing milk and meat, but horticulture seems to have remained unknown far into this period. Footnote. The data of the 1880s has been proved partially inaccurate. While it is true that the Mesopotamians domesticated animals, around the same time they were also the first farmers in world history, in around 10,000 BCE. The exact sequence is unknown. End of footnote. It was apparently the domestication and breeding of animals and the formation of herds of considerable size that led to the differentiation of the Aryans and Semites from the mass of barbarians. Footnote. It is important to point out Engles' coupling of Aryans and Semites. Information on Mesopotamia was limited to biblical text until the mid-19th century. It was not until the 1850s onwards when archaeology began to explore and gain historical evidence in Mesopotamia. This coupling therefore is likely a combination of both biblical text, referring to the biblical peoples, Aryans and Semites, instead of the region Mesopotamia, and contemporary archaeological work, the data of his conclusions. Another facet of this combination was Engels' lack of prejudice. By the 19th century, Aryans were thought to be a unique human race and were cited as scientific evidence of racial superiority. Even later, this would evolve into the theory that the Germans were the most quote-unquote pure Aryans. This popular theory would not be disproved by anthropologists until the 20th century. The fact that Engels couples them together evidences a noteworthy lack of the prevalent racism of the time. End of footnote. The European and Asiatic Aryans still have the same names for cattle, but those for most of the cultivated plants are already different. In suitable localities, the keeping of herds led to a pastoral life. The Semites lived upon the grassy plains of the Euphrates and Tigris, and the Aryans upon those of India, and of the Oxus and Jaxartes of the Don and the Dnieper. It must have been on the borders of such pasture lands that animals were first domesticated. To later generations, consequently, the pastoral tribes appeared to have come from regions which, so far from being the cradle of mankind, were almost uninhabitable for their savage ancestors, and even for man at the lower stages of barbarism. But having once accustomed themselves to pastoral life in the grassy plains of the rivers, these barbarians of the Middle Period would never have dreamed of returning willingly to the native forests of their ancestors. Even when they were forced further to the north and west, the Semites and Aryans could not move into the forest regions of Western Asia and of Europe until by cultivation of grain they had made possible to pasture and especially to winter their herds on this less favorable land. It is more than probable that among these tribes the cultivation of grain originated from the need for cattle fodder and only later became important as a human food supply. The plentiful supply of milk and meat, and especially the beneficial effects of these foods on the growth of the children, account perhaps for the superior development of the Aryan and Semitic races. It is a fact that the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico, who are reduced to an almost entirely vegetarian diet, have a smaller brain than the Indians at the lower stage of barbarism, who eat more meat and fish. Footnote. The theory that the larger brain is more intelligent was disproven by the end of the 19th century. Intelligence can be generally compared by brain size relative to body size. Because the Pueblo Indians were smaller humans, naturally their brains were smaller. The same is true for Africans, who are larger, and so their brains are larger. End of footnote. In any case, cannibalism now gradually dies out, surviving only as a religious act or as a means of working magic, which is here almost the same thing. C. Upper stage. Begins with the smelting of iron ore and passes into civilization with the invention of alphabetic writing and its use for literary records. This stage, as we have seen only the Eastern Hemisphere pass through it independently, is richer in advances in production than all the preceding stages together. To it belong the Greeks of the heroic age, the tribes of Italy shortly before the foundation of Rome, the Germans of Tacitus, and the Norsemen of the Viking Age. Footnote. This is mistaken. The Mesopotamian, 3500 to 1000 BCE, Egyptian, 3000 to 500 BCE, Harappan, 5000 to 2000 BCE, and Chinese, 2000 BCE to 1800 CE, civilizations long preceded the Europeans in this stage. The Greeks were the first in Europe at around 500 BCE. End of footnote. Above all, we now first meet the iron plowshare drawn by cattle, which made large-scale agriculture, the cultivation of fields, possible, and thus created a practically unrestricted food supply in comparison with previous conditions. This led to the clearance of forest land for tillage and pasture, which in turn was impossible on a large scale without the iron axe and the iron spade. Population rapidly increased in number and in small areas became dense. Prior to field agriculture, conditions must have been very exceptional if they allowed 500,000 people to be united under a central organization. Probably such a thing never occurred. We find the upper stage of barbarism at its highest in the Homeric poems, particularly in the Iliad. Fully developed iron tools, the bellows, the hand mill, the potter's wheel, the making of oil and wine, metalwork developing almost into a fine art, the wagon and the war chariot, shipbuilding with beams and planks, the beginnings of architecture as art, walled cities with towers and battlements, the Homeric epic and a complete mythology. These are the chief legacy brought by the Greeks from barbarism into civilization. When we compare the descriptions which Caesar and even Tacitus give of the Germans, who stood at the beginning of the cultural stage from which the Homeric Greeks were just preparing to make the next advance, we realize how rich was the development of production within the upper stage of barbarism. The sketch which I have given here, following Morgan, of the development of mankind through savagery and barbarism to the beginnings of civilization, is already rich enough in new features. What is more, they cannot be disputed, since they are drawn directly from the process of production. Yet my sketch will seem flat and feeble, compared with the picture to be unrolled at the end of our travels. Only then will the transition from barbarism to civilization stand out in full light and in all its striking contrasts. For the time being, Morgan's division may be summarized thus. Savagery, the period in which man's appropriation of products in their natural state predominates. The products of human art are chiefly instruments which assist this appropriation. Barbarism, the period during which man learns to breed domestic animals and to practice agriculture, and acquires methods of increasing the supply of natural products by human activity. Civilization, the period in which man learns a more advanced application of work to the products of nature, the period of industry proper and of art. Chapter 2. The Family. Morgan, who spent a great part of his life among the Iroquois Indians, settled to this day in New York State, and was adopted into one of their tribes, the Senecas, found in use among them a system of consanguinity which was in contradiction to their actual family relationships. There prevailed among them a form of monogamy easily terminable on both sides, which Morgan calls the quote-unquote pairing family. The issue of the married pair was therefore known and recognized by everybody. There could be no doubt about whom to call father, mother, son, daughter, brother, sister, but these names were actually used quite differently. The Iroquois calls not only his own children his sons and daughters, but also the children of his brothers, and they call him father. The children of his sisters, however, he calls his nephews and nieces, and they call him their uncle. The Iroquois woman, on the other hand, calls her sister's children, as well as her own, her sons and daughters, and they call her mother. But her brother's children, she calls her nephews and nieces, and she is known as their aunt. Similarly, the children of brothers call one another brother and sister, and so do the children of sisters. A woman's own children and the children of her brother, on the other hand, call one another cousins. And these are not mere empty names, but expressions of actual conceptions of nearness and remoteness, of equality and difference in the degrees of consanguinity. These conceptions serve as the foundation of a fully elaborated system of consanguinity, through which several hundred different relationships of one individual can be expressed. What is more, this system is not only in full force among all American Indians, no exception has been found up to the present, but also retains its validity almost unchanged among the Aborigines of India, the Dravidian tribes in the Deccan, and the Gora tribes in Hindustan. To this day, the Tamils of southern India and the Iroquois Seneca Indians in New York State still express more than 200 degrees of consanguinity in the same manner. And among these tribes of India, as among all the American Indians, the actual relationships arising out of the existing form of the family contradict the system of consanguinity. How is this to be explained? In view of the decisive part played by consanguinity in the social structure of all savage and barbarian peoples, the importance of a system so widespread cannot be dismissed with phrases. When a system is general throughout America and also exists in Asia among peoples of a quite different race, when numerous instances of it are found with greater or less variation in every part of Africa and Australia, then that system has to be historically explained, not talked out of existence, as McLennan, for example, tried to do. The names of father, child, brother, sister are no mere complementary forms of address. They involve quite definite and very serious mutual obligations, which together make up an essential part of the social constitution of the peoples in question. The explanation was found. In the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, there still existed in the first half of the 19th century a form of family in which the fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters, uncles and aunts, nephews and nieces, were exactly what is required by the American and Old Indian system of consanguinity. But now comes a strange thing. Once again, the system of consanguinity in force in Hawaii did not correspond to the actual form of the Hawaiian family. For according to the Hawaiian system of consanguinity, all children of brothers and sisters are without exception brothers and sisters of one another, and are considered to be the common children not only of their mother and her sisters, or of their father and his brothers, but of all the brothers and sisters of both their parents without distinction. While therefore the American system of consanguinity presupposes a more primitive form of the family which has disappeared in America, but still actually exists in Hawaii, the Hawaiian system of consanguinity, on the other hand, points to a still earlier form of the family which, though we can nowhere prove it to be still in existence, nevertheless must have existed, for otherwise the corresponding system of consanguinity could never have arisen. The family, says Morgan, quote, represents an active principle. It is never stationary, but advances from a lower to a higher form, as society advances from a lower to a higher condition. Systems of consanguinity, on the contrary, are passive, recording the progress made by the family at long intervals apart, and only changing radically when the family has radically changed. Unquote. Morgan, Opus Citato, page 444. And, adds Marx, quote, the same is true of the political, juridical, religious, and philosophical systems in general. Unquote. While the family undergoes living changes, the system of consanguinity ossifies. While the system survives by force of custom, the family outgrows it. But just as Cuvier could deduce from the marsupial bone of an animal skeleton found near Paris that it belonged to a marsupial animal, and that extinct marsupial animals once lived there, so with the same certainty we can deduce from the historical survival of a system of consanguinity that an extinct form of family once existed, which corresponded to it. The systems of consanguinity and the forms of the family we have just mentioned differ from those of today in the fact that every child has more than one father and mother. In the American system of consanguinity, to which the Hawaiian family corresponds, brother and sister cannot be the father and mother of the same child, but the Hawaiian system of consanguinity, on the contrary, presupposes a family in which this was the rule. Here we find ourselves among forms of family which directly contradict those hitherto generally assumed to be alone valid. The traditional view recognizes only monogamy, with, in addition, polygamy on the part of individual men, and at the very most, polyandry on the part of individual women. Being the view of moralizing Philistines, it conceals the fact that, in practice, these barriers raised by official society are quietly and calmly ignored. The study of primitive history, however, reveals conditions where the men live in polygamy and their wives in polyandry at the same time, and their common children are therefore considered common to them all, and these conditions in their turn undergo a long series of changes before they finally end in monogamy. The trend of these changes is to narrow more and more the circle of people comprised within the common bond of marriage, which was originally very wide, until at last it includes only the single pair, the dominant form of marriage today. Reconstructing thus the past history of the family, Morgan, in agreement with most of his colleagues, arrives at a primitive stage when unrestricted sexual freedom prevailed within the tribe, every woman belonging equally to every man, and every man to every woman. Since the 18th century, there had been talk of such a primitive state, but only in general phrases. Bahofen, and this is one of his great merits, was the first to take the existence of such a state seriously and to search for its traces in historical and religious survivals. Today we know that the traces he found do not lead back to a social stage of promiscuous sexual intercourse, but to a much later form, namely group marriage. The primitive social stage of promiscuity, if it ever existed, belongs to such a remote epoch that we can hardly expect to prove its existence directly by discovering its social fossils among backward savages. Pahofen's merit consists in having brought this question to the forefront for examination. Footnote: Pahofen proves how little he understood his own discovery, or rather his guess, by using the term heterism to describe his primitive state. For the Greeks, when they introduced the word, heterism meant intercourse of men, unmarried or living in monogamy with unmarried women, it always presupposes a definite form of marriage outside which this intercourse takes place and includes at least the possibility of prostitution. The word was never used in any other sense, and it is in this sense that I use it with Morgan. Bauhofen everywhere introduces into his extremely important discoveries the most incredible mystifications through his notion that in their historical development the relations between men and women had their origin in men's contemporary religious conceptions, not in their actual conditions of life. End of footnote. Lately it has become fashionable to deny the existence of this initial stage in human sexual life. Humanity must be spared this quote-unquote shame. It is pointed out that all direct proof of such a stage is lacking, and particular appeal is made to the evidence from the rest of the animal world. For even among animals, according to the numerous facts collected by Le Tournier, Évolution du ménage et de la faux, 1888, complete promiscuity in sexual intercourse marks a low stage of development. But the only conclusion I can draw from all these facts, so far as man and his primitive conditions of life are concerned, is that they prove nothing whatever. That vertebrates mate together for a considerable period is sufficiently explained by physiological causes. In the case of birds, for example, by the female's need of help during the brooding period. Examples of faithful monogamy among birds prove nothing about man, for the simple reason that men are not descended from birds. And if strict monogamy is the height of all virtue, then the palm must go to the tapeworm, which is a complete set of male and female sexual organs in each of its 50 to 200 troglodytes or sections, and spends its whole life copulating in all its sections with itself. Confining ourselves to mammals, however, we find all forms of sexual life: promiscuity, indications of group marriage, polygyny, monogamy. Polyandry alone is lacking. It took human beings to achieve that. Even our nearest relations, the quadrumana, exhibit every possible variation in the grouping of males and females. And if we narrow it down still more and consider only the 4 anthropoid apes, all that Le Tournier has to say about them is that they are sometimes monogamous, sometimes polygamous, while Saussure, quoted by Giraud-Tellon, maintains that they are monogamous. The more recent assertions of the monogamous habits of the anthropoid apes, which are cited by Westermarck, The History of Human Marriage, London, 1891, are also very far from proving anything. In short, our evidence is such that honest Le Tournier admits, quote, "Among mammals, there is no strict relation between the degree of intellectual development and the form of sexual life," unquote. And Espina's De Societés Animantes, 1877, says in so many words, quote, "The herd is the highest social group which we can observe among animals. It is composed, so it appears, of families, but from the start the family and the herd are in conflict with one another and develop in inverse proportion," unquote. As the above shows, we know practically nothing definite about the family and other social groupings of the anthropoid apes. The evidence is flatly contradictory, which is not to be wondered at. The evidence with regard to savage human tribes is contradictory enough, requiring very critical examination and sifting, and ape societies are far more difficult to observe than human. For the present, therefore, we must reject any conclusion drawn from such completely unreliable reports. The sentence quoted from Espina's, however, provides a better starting point. Among the higher animals, the herd and the family are not complementary to one another, but antagonistic. Espina's shows very well how the jealousy of the males during the mating season loosens the ties of every social herd or temporarily breaks it up. Quote, "When the family bond is close and exclusive, herds form only in exceptional cases. When, on the other hand, free sexual intercourse or polygamy prevails, the herd comes into being almost spontaneously. Before a herd can be formed, family ties must be loosened, and the individual must have become free again. This is the reason why organized flocks are so rarely found among birds. We find more or less organized societies among mammals, however, precisely because here the individual is not merged in the family. In its first growth, therefore, the common feeling of the herd has no greater enemy than the common feeling of the family. We state without hesitation, only by absorbing families which had undergone a radical change could a social form higher than the family have developed. At the same time, these families were thereby enabled later to constitute themselves afresh under infinitely more favorable circumstances." Unquote. Here we see that animal societies are, after all, of some value for drawing conclusions about human societies. But the value is only negative. So far as our evidence goes, the higher vertebrates know only two forms of family, polygyny or separate couples. Each form allows only one adult male, only one husband. The jealousy of the male, which both consolidates and isolates the family, sets the animal family in opposition to the herd. The jealousy of the males prevents the herd, the higher social form, from coming into existence, or weakens its cohesion, or breaks it up during the mating period. At best, it attests its development. This alone is sufficient proof that animal families and primitive human society are incompatible, and that when primitive men were working their way up from the animal creation, they either had no family at all, or a form that does not occur among animals. In small numbers, an animal so defenseless as evolving man might struggle along even in conditions of isolation with no higher social grouping than the single male and female pair, such as Westermarck, following the reports of hunters, attributes to the gorillas and the chimpanzees. For man's development beyond the level of the animals, for the achievement of the greatest advance nature can show, something more was needed. The power of defense lacking to the individual had to be made good by the united strength and cooperation of the herd. To explain the transition to humanity from conditions such as those in which the anthropoid apes live today would be quite impossible. It looks much more as if these apes had strayed off the line of evolution and were gradually dying out, or at least degenerating. That alone is sufficient ground for rejecting all attempts based on parallels drawn between forms of family and those of primitive man. Mutual toleration among the adult males, freedom from jealousy, was the first condition for the formation of those larger, permanent groups in which alone animals could become men. And what, in fact, do we find to be the oldest and most primitive form of family, whose historical existence we can indisputably prove, and which in one or two parts of the world we can still study today? Group marriage, the form of family in which whole groups of men and whole groups of women mutually possess one another, and which leaves little room for jealousy. And at a later stage of development, we find the exceptional form of polyandry, which positively revolts every jealous instinct, and is therefore unknown among animals. But as all known forms of group marriage are accompanied by such peculiarly complicated regulations that they necessarily point to earlier and simpler forms of sexual relations, and therefore in the last resort to a period of promiscuous intercourse corresponding to the transition from the animal to the human, the references to animal marriages only bring us back to the very point from which we were to be led away for good and all. What then does promiscuous sexual intercourse really mean? It means the absence of prohibitions and restrictions, which are or have been in force. We have already seen the barrier of jealousy go down. If there is one thing certain, it is that the feeling of jealousy develops relatively late. The same is true of the conception of incest. Not only were brother and sister originally man and wife, sexual intercourse between parents and children is still permitted among many peoples today. Bancroft, The Native Races of the Pacific States of North America, 1875, Volume 1, testifies to it among the Kadiaks on the Bering Straits, the Kadiaks near Alaska, and the Tinei in the interior of British North America, Leternier compiled reports of it among the Chippewa Indians, the Cuckoos in Chile, the Karens in Burma, to say nothing of the stories told by the old Greeks and Romans about the Parthians, Persians, Scythians, Huns, and so on. Before incest was invented, for incest is an invention, and a very valuable one too, sexual intercourse between parents and children did not arouse any more repulsion than sexual intercourse between any other persons of different generations. And that occurs today even in the most Philistine countries without exciting any great horror. Even old maids of over 60, if they are rich enough, sometimes marry young men in their 30s. But if we consider the most primitive forms of family, apart from their conceptions of incest, conceptions which are totally different from ours and frequently in direct contradiction to them, then the form of sexual intercourse can only be described as promiscuous. Promiscuous insofar as the restrictions later established by custom did not yet exist. But in everyday practice, that by no means necessarily implies general mixed mating. Temporary pairings of one man with one woman were not in any way excluded, just as in the cases of group marriages today, the majority of relationships are of this character. And when Westermarck, the latest writer to deny the existence of such a primitive state, applies the term marriage to every relationship in which the two sexes remain mated until the birth of the offspring, we must point out that this kind of marriage can very well occur under the conditions of promiscuous intercourse without contradicting the principle of promiscuity, the absence of any restriction imposed by custom on sexual intercourse. Westermarck, however, takes the standpoint that promiscuity, quote, involves a suppression of individual inclinations, unquote, and that therefore, quote, the most genuine form of it is prostitution, unquote. In my opinion, any understanding of primitive society is impossible to people who only see it as a brothel. We will return to this point when discussing group marriage. According to Morgan, from this primitive state of promiscuous intercourse, there developed probably very early 1. The consanguine family, the first stage of the family. Here, the marriage groups are separated according to generations. All the grandfathers and grandmothers within the limits of the family are all husbands and wives of one another. So are also their children, the fathers and mothers. The latter's children will form a third circle of common husbands and wives, and their children, the great-grandchildren of the first group, will form a fourth. In this form of marriage, therefore, only ancestors and progeny, and parents and children are excluded from the rights and duties, as we should say, of marriage with one another. Brothers and sisters, male and female cousins of the first, second, and more remote degrees, are all brothers and sisters of one another, and precisely for that reason they are all husbands and wives of one another. At this stage of relationship of brother and sister also includes as a matter of course the practice of sexual intercourse with one another. Footnote. In a letter written in the spring of 1882, Marx expresses himself in the strongest terms about the complete misrepresentation of primitive times in Wagner's text to the Nibelungen. Quote, have such things been heard that brother embraced sister as a bride? Quote, to Wagner and his lecherous gods, who quite in the modern manner spice their love affairs with a little incest, Marx replies, quote, in primitive times the sister was the wife, and that was moral, unquote. End of footnote. In its typical form, such a family would consist of the descendants of a single pair, the descendants of these descendants in each generation, being again brothers and sisters, and therefore husbands and wives of one another. Note in the 4th edition, a French friend of mine, who is an admirer of Wagner, is not in agreement with this note. He observes that already in the Elder Edda, on which Wagner based his story, in the Egistrekka, Loki makes the reproach to Freya, in the sight of the gods, thou didst embrace thine own brother. Marriage between brother and sister, he argues, was therefore forbidden already at that time. The Egistrekka is the expression of a time when belief in the old myths had completely broken down. It is purely a satire on the gods in the style of Lucian. If Loki as Mephisto makes such a reproach to Freya, it tells rather against Wagner. Loki also says some lines later to Njörður, with thy sisters didst thou breed son. Njörður is not indeed an Asa, but a Vana, and says in the Ynglinga saga that marriages between brothers and sisters are usual in Vanaland, which was not the case among the Asas. This would seem to show that the Vanas were more ancient gods than Asas. At any rate, near the lines among the Egistreka is rather a proof that at the time when the Norse sagas of the gods arose, marriages between brothers and sisters, at any rate among the gods, did not yet excite any horror. If one wants to find excuses for Wagner, it would perhaps be better to cite Goethe instead of the Edda, for in his ballad of the god and the Bayadir, Goethe commits a similar mistake in regard to the religious surrender of women, which he makes far too similar to modern prostitution. End of footnote. The consanguine family is extinct. Even the most primitive peoples known to history provide no demonstrable instance of it, but that it must have existed, we are compelled to admit, for the Hawaiian system of consanguinity, still prevalent today throughout the whole of Polynesia, expresses degrees of consanguinity which could only arise in this form of family, and the whole subsequent development of the family presupposes the existence of the consanguine family as a necessary preparatory stage. 2. The Panaluan family. If the first advance in organization consisted in the exclusion of parents and children from sexual intercourse with one another, the second was the exclusion of sister and brother. On account of the greater nearness in age, this second advance was infinitely more important, but also more difficult than the first. It was effected gradually, beginning probably with the exclusion from sexual intercourse of own brothers and sisters, children of the same mother, first in isolated cases and then by degrees as a general rule. Even in this century, exceptions were found in Hawaii, and ending with the prohibition of marriage even between collateral brothers and sisters, or, as we should say, between first, second, and third cousins. It affords, says Morgan, quote, a good illustration of the operation of the principle of natural selection, unquote. There can be no question that the tribes among whom inbreeding was restricted by this advance were bound to develop more quickly and more fully than those among whom marriage between brothers and sisters remained the rule and the law. How powerfully the influence of this advance made itself felt is seen in the institution which arose directly out of it and went far beyond it, the gens, which formed the basis of the social order of most, if not all, barbarian peoples of the earth, and from which, in Greece and Rome, we stepped directly into civilization. After a few generations at most, every original family was bound to split up. The practice of living together in a primitive communistic household, which prevailed without exception till late in the middle stage of barbarism, set a limit, varying with the conditions, but fairly definite in each locality, to the maximum size of the family community. As soon as the conception arose that sexual intercourse between children of the same mother was wrong, it was bound to exert its influence when the old households split up and new ones were founded, though these did not necessarily coincide with the family group. One or more lines of sisters would form the nucleus of the one household, and their own brothers the nucleus of the other. It must have been in some such manner as this that the form which Morgan calls the Panaluan family originated out of the consanguine family. According to the Hawaiian custom, a number of sisters, own or collateral, first, second, or more remote cousins, were the common wives of their common husbands, from among whom, however, their own brothers were excluded. These husbands now no longer called themselves brothers, for they were no longer necessarily brothers, but Panalua, that is, intimate companion or partner. Similarly, a line of own or collateral brothers had a number of women, not their sisters, as common wives, and these wives called one another Panalua. This was the classic form of a type of family, in which later a number of variations was possible, but whose essential feature was mutually common possession of husbands and wives within a definite family circle, from which, however, the brothers of the wives, first own and later also collateral, and conversely also the sisters of the husbands, were excluded. This form of the family provides with the most complete exactness the degrees of consanguinity expressed in the American system. The children of my mother's sisters are still her children, just as the children of my father's brothers are also his children, and they are all my brothers and sisters. But the children of my mother's brother are now her nephews and nieces. The children of my father's sisters are his nephews and nieces, and they are all my male and female cousins. For while the husbands of my mother's sisters are still her husbands, and the wives of my father's brothers are still his wives, in right, if not always in fact, the social ban on sexual intercourse between brothers and sisters has now divided the children of brothers and sisters, who had hitherto been treated as own brothers and sisters, into two classes. Those in the one class remain the brothers and sisters as before, collateral according to our system. Those in the other class, the children of my mother's brother in the one case and of my father's sister in the other, cannot be brothers and sisters any longer. They can no longer have common parents, neither father nor mother nor both, and therefore now for the first time the class of nephews and nieces, male and female cousins, becomes necessary, which in the earlier composition of the family would have been senseless. The American system of consanguinity, which appears purely nonsensical in any form of family, based on any variety of monogamy, finds, down to the smallest detail, its rational explanation and its natural foundation in the Panaluan family. The Panaluan family, or a form similar to it, must have been, at the very least, as widespread as this system of consanguinity. Evidence of this form of family, whose existence has actually been proved in Hawaii, would probably have been received from all over Polynesia if the pious missionaries, like the Spanish monks of former days in America, had been able to see in such unchristian conditions anything more than a sheer quote-unquote abomination. Footnote. There can no longer be any doubt that the traces which Bachofen thought he had found of unrestricted sexual intercourse, or what he calls, quote, spontaneous generation in the slime, unquote, go back to group marriage. Quote, if Bachofen considers these Panaluan marriages lawless, a man of that period would consider most of the present-day marriages between near and remote cousins on the father's or mother's side to be incestuous, as being marriages between blood brothers and sisters, unquote. Marx. End of footnote. Caesar's report of the Britons, who were at that time in the middle stage of barbarism, quote, every 10 or 12 have wives in common, especially brothers with brothers and parents with children, unquote, is best explained as group marriage. Barbarian mothers do not have 10 or 12 sons of their own old enough to keep wives in common, but the American system of consanguinity, which corresponds to the Panaluan family, provides numerous brothers because all a man's cousins, near and distant, are his brothers. Caesar's mention of, quote, parents with children, unquote, may be due to misunderstanding on his part. It is not, however, absolutely impossible under this system that father and son or mother and daughter should be included in the same marriage group, though not father and daughter or mother and son. This or a similar form of group marriage also provides the simplest explanation of the accounts in Herodotus and other ancient writers about community of wives among savages and barbarian peoples. The same applies also to the reports of Watson and Kay in their book The People of India about the Tihurs in Oudh, north of the Ganges. Quote, both sexes have but a nominal tie on each other, and they change connection without compunction, living together almost indiscriminately in many large families, unquote. In the very great majority of cases, the institution of the gens seems to have originated directly out of the Panaluan family. It is true that the Australian classificatory system also provides an origin for it. The Australians have gentes, but not yet the benevolent family. Instead, they have a cruder form of group marriage. In all forms of group family, it is uncertain who is the father of a child, but it is certain who its mother is. Though she calls all the children of the whole family her children and has a mother's duties towards them, she nevertheless knows her own children from the others. It is therefore clear that in so far as group marriage prevails, descent can only be proved on the mother's side, and that therefore only the female line is recognized. And this is in fact the case among all peoples in the period of savagery or in the lower stage of barbarism. It is the second great merit of Bahofen that he was the first to make this discovery. To denote this exclusive recognition of descent through the mother and the relations of inheritance, which in time resulted from it, he uses the term mother right, which for the sake of brevity I retain. The term is, however, ill chosen, since at this stage of society there cannot yet be any talk of right in the legal sense. If we now take one of the two standard groups of the Penaluan family, namely a line of own and collateral sisters, that is, own sisters' children in the first, second, or third degree, together with their children and their own collateral brothers on the mother's side, who, according to our assumption, are not their husbands, we have the exact circle of persons whom we later find as members of a gens, in the original form of that institution. They all have a common ancestral mother, by virtue of their descent from whom the female offspring in each generation are sisters. The husbands of these sisters, however, can no longer be their brothers, and therefore cannot be descended from the same ancestral mother. Consequently, they do not belong to the same consanguine group, the later gens. The children of these sisters, however, do belong to this group, because descent on the mother's side alone counts, since it alone is certain. As soon as the ban had been established on sexual intercourse between all brothers and sisters, including the most remote collateral relatives on the mother's side, this group transformed itself into a gens. That is, it constituted itself a firm circle of blood relations in the female line, between whom marriage was prohibited, and henceforward, by other common institutions of a social and religious character, it increasingly consolidated and differentiated itself from the other gentes of the same tribe. More of this later. When we see, then, that the development of the gens follows not only necessarily, but also perfectly naturally from the Penaluan family, we may reasonably infer that at one time this form of family almost certainly existed among all peoples, among whom the presence of Gentile institutions can be proved, that is, practically all barbarians and civilized peoples. At the time Morgan wrote his book, our knowledge of group marriage was still very limited. A little information was available about the group marriages of the Australians, who were organized in classes, and Morgan had already in 1871 published the reports he had received concerning the Penaluan family in Hawaii. The Penaluan family provided, on the one hand, the complete explanation of the system of consanguinity in force among the American Indians, which had been the starting point of all Morgan's researches. On the other hand, the origin of the matriarchal gens could be derived directly from the Penaluan family. Further, the Penaluan family represented a much higher stage of development than the Australian classificatory system. It is therefore comprehensible that Morgan should have regarded it as the necessary stage of development before pairing marriage, and should believe it to have been general in earlier times. Since then, we have become acquainted with a number of other forms of group marriage, and we now know that Morgan here went too far. However, in his Penaluan family, he had the good fortune to strike the highest, the classic form of group marriage, from which the transition to a higher stage can be explained most simply. For the most important additions to our knowledge of group marriage, we are indebted to the English missionary Lorimer Faison, who for years studied this form of the family in its classic home, Australia. He found the lowest stage of development among the Australian Aborigines of Mount Gambier in South Australia. Here the whole tribe is divided into two great exogamous classes, or moieties, Croaky and Kumite. Sexual intercourse within each of these moieties is strictly forbidden. On the other hand, every man in the one moiety is the husband by birth of every woman in the other moiety, and she is by birth his wife. Not the individuals, but the entire groups are married, moiety with moiety. And observe that there is no exclusion on the ground of difference in age or particular degrees of affinity, except such as is entailed by the division of the tribe into two exogamous classes. A Croki has every Kumite woman lawfully to wife, but as his own daughter, according to mother right, is also a Kumite, being the daughter of a Kumite woman, she is by birth the wife of every Croki, including therefore her father. At any rate, there is no bar against this in the organization into moieties as we know it. Either then, this organization arose at a time when, in spite of the obscure impulse towards the restriction of inbreeding, sexual intercourse between parents and children was still not felt to be particularly horrible, in which case the moiety system must have originated directly out of a state of sexual promiscuity, or else intercourse between parents and children was already forbidden by custom when the moieties arose, and in that case the present conditions point back to the consanguine family and are the first step beyond it. The latter is more probable. There are not, to my knowledge, any instances from Australia of sexual cohabitation between parents and children, and as a rule, the later form of exogamy, the matriarchal gens, also tacitly presupposes the prohibition of this relationship as already in force when the gens came into being. The system of two moieties is found not only at Mount Gambier in South Australia, but also on the Darling River further to the east and in Queensland in the northeast. It is therefore widely distributed. It excludes marriages only between brothers and sisters, between the children of brothers and between the children of sisters on the mother's side, because these belong to the same moiety. The children of sisters and brothers, however, may marry. A further step towards the prevention of inbreeding was taken by the Kamilaroi on the Darling River in New South Wales. The two original moieties are split up into four, and again each of these four sections is married en bloc to another. The first two sections are husbands and wives of one another by birth, according to whether the mother belonged to the first or second section, the children go into the third or fourth. The children of these last two sections, which are also married to one another, come again into the first and second sections. Thus, one generation always belongs to the first and second sections, the next to the third and fourth, and the generation after that to the first and second again. Under this system, first cousins on the mother's side cannot be man and wife, but second cousins can. This peculiarly complicated arrangement is made still more intricate by having matriarchal gentes grafted onto it, at any rate later, but we cannot go into the details of this now. What is significant is how the urge towards the prevention of inbreeding asserts itself again and again, feeling its way, however, quite instinctively, without clear consciousness of its aim. Group marriage, which in these instances from Australia is still marriage of sections, mass marriage of an entire section of men, often scattered over the whole continent, with an equally widely distributed section of women, this group marriage, seen close at hand, does not look quite so terrible as the Philistines, whose mind cannot go beyond brothels, imagine it to be. On the contrary, for years its existence was not even suspected, and has now quite recently been questioned again. All that the superficial observer sees in group marriage is a loose form of monogamous marriage, here and there polygyny and occasional infidelities. It takes years, as it took Faison and Howlett, to discover beneath these marriage customs, which in their actual practice should seem almost familiar to the average European, their controlling law, the law by which the Australian Aborigine, wandering hundreds of miles from his home among people whose language he does not understand, nevertheless often finds in every camp and every tribe women who give themselves to him without resistance and without resentment. The law by which the man with several wives gives one up for the night to his guest. Where the European sees immorality and lawlessness, strict law rules in reality. The women belong to the marriage group of the stranger, and therefore they are his wives by birth. That same law of custom, which gives the two to one another, forbids under penalty of outlawry all intercourse outside the marriage groups that belong together. Even when wives are captured, as frequently occurs in many places, the law of the exogamous classes is still carefully observed. Marriage by capture, it may be remarked, already shows signs of the transition to monogamous marriage, at least in the form of pairing marriage. When the young man has captured or abducted a girl with the help of his friends, she is enjoyed by all of them in turn, but afterwards she is regarded as the wife of the young man who instigated her capture. If, on the other hand, the captured woman runs away from her husband and is caught by another man, she becomes his wife and the first husband loses his rights. Thus, while group marriage continues to exist as the general form, side by side with group marriage, and within it, exclusive relationships begin to form, pairings for a longer or shorter period, also polygyny. Thus, group marriage is already dying out here too, and the only question is which will disappear first under European influence, group marriage or the Australian Aborigines who practice it. Marriage between entire sections, as it prevails in Australia, is in any case a very low and primitive form of group marriage, whereas the Panaluan family, so far as we know, represents its highest stage of development. The former appears to be the form corresponding to the social level of vagrant savages, while the latter already presupposes relatively permanent settlements of communistic communities and leads immediately to the successive higher phase of development. But we shall certainly find more than one intermediate stage between these two forms. Here lies a newly discovered field of research, which is still almost completely unexplored. 3. The pairing family. A certain amount of pairing for a longer or shorter period already occurred in group marriage, or even earlier. The man had a chief wife among his many wives. One can hardly yet speak of a favorite wife, and for her he was the most important among her husbands. This fact has contributed considerably to the confusion of the missionaries, who have regarded group marriage sometimes as promiscuous community of wives, sometimes as unbridled adultery. But these customary pairings were bound to grow more stable as the gens developed, and the classes of brothers and sisters, between whom marriage was impossible, became more numerous. The impulse given by the gens to the prevention of marriage between blood relatives extended still further. Thus, among the Iroquois and most of the other Indians at the lower stage of barbarism, we find that marriage is prohibited between all relatives enumerated in their system, which includes several hundred degrees of kinship. The increasing complication of these prohibitions made group marriage more and more impossible. They were displaced by the pairing family. In this stage, one man lives with one woman, but the relationship is such that polygamy and occasional infidelity remains the right of the men, even though for economic reasons polygamy is rare, while from the woman the strictest fidelity is generally demanded throughout the time she lives with the man, and adultery on her part is cruelly punished. The marriage tie can, however, be easily dissolved by either partner. After separation, the children still belong, as before, to the mother alone. In this ever-extending exclusion of blood relatives from the bond of marriage, natural selection continues its work. In Morgan's words, quote, "The influence of the new practice, which brought unrelated persons into the marriage relation, tended to create a more vigorous stock physically and mentally. When two advancing tribes with strong mental and physical characters are brought together and blended into one people by the accidents of barbarous life, the new skull and brain would widen and lengthen to the sum of the capabilities of both." Unquote. Tribes with Gentile constitution were thus bound to gain supremacy over more backward tribes, or else to carry them along by their example. Thus, the history of the family in primitive times consists in the progressive narrowing of the circle, originally embracing the whole tribe, within which the two sexes have a common conjugal relation. The continuous exclusion, first of nearer, then of more and more remote relatives, and at last even of relatives by marriage, ends by making any kind of group marriage practically impossible. Finally, there remains only the single, still loosely linked pair, the molecule with whose dissolution marriage itself ceases. This in itself shows what a small part individual sex love, in the modern sense of the word, played in the rise of monogamy. Yet stronger proof is afforded by the practice of all peoples at this stage of development. Whereas in the earlier forms of the family, men never lacked women, but on the contrary had too many rather than too few, women had now become scarce and highly sought after. Hence, it is with the pairing marriage that there begins the capture and purchase of women. Widespread symptoms, but no more than symptoms, of the much deeper change that had occurred. These symptoms, mere methods of procuring wives, the pedantic Scot, MacLennan, has transmogrified into special classes of families under the names of quote-unquote marriage by capture and quote-unquote marriage by purchase. In general, whether among the American Indians or other peoples at the same stage, the conclusion of a marriage is the affair, not of the two parties concerned, who are often not consulted at all, but of their mothers. Two persons entirely unknown to each other are often thus affianced. They only learn that the bargain has been struck when the time for marrying approaches. Before the wedding, the bridegroom gives presents to the bride's Gentile relatives, to those on the mother's side, therefore not to the father and his relations, which are regarded as gift payments in return for the girl. The marriage is still terminable at the desire of either partner, but among many tribes, the Iroquois for example, public opinion has gradually developed against such separations. When differences arise between husband and wife, the gents relatives of both partners act as mediators, and only if these efforts prove fruitless does a separation take place, the wife then keeping the children, and each partner being free to marry again. The pairing family, itself too weak and unstable to make an independent household necessary or even desirable, in no wise destroys the communistic household inherited from earlier times. Communistic housekeeping, however, means the supremacy of women in the house, just as the exclusive recognition of the female parent, owing to the impossibility of recognizing the male parent with certainty, means that the women, the mothers, are held in high respect. One of the most absurd notions, taken over from 18th century Enlightenment, is that in the beginning of society, woman was the slave of man. Among all savages and all barbarians of the lower and middle stages, and to a certain extent of the upper stage also, the position of women is not only free but honorable. As to what it still is in the pairing marriage, let us hear the evidence of Asher Wright, for many years missionary among the Iroquois Senecas. Quote, as to their family system, when occupying the old longhouses, it is probable that some one clan predominated, the women taking in husbands, however, from the other clans. Usually the female portion ruled the house. The stores were in common, but woe to the luckless husband or lover who was too shiftless to do his share of the providing. No matter how many children or whatever goods he might have in the house, he might at any time be ordered to pick up his blanket and budge. And after such orders, it would not be healthful for him to attempt to disobey. The house would be too hot for him, and he must retreat to his own clan, or, as was often done, go and start a new matrimonial alliance in some other. The women were the great power among the clans, as everywhere else. They did not hesitate, when occasion required, quote-unquote, to knock off the horns, as it was technically called, from the head of a chief and send him back to the ranks of the warriors. Unquote. The communistic household in which most or all of the women belong to one and the same gens, while the men come from various gentes, is the material foundation of that supremacy of women, which was general in primitive times, and which it is Baahofen's third great merit to have discovered. The reports of travelers and missionaries, I may add, to the effect that women among savages and barbarians are overburdened with work in no way contradict what has been said. The division of labor between the two sexes is determined by quite other causes than by the position of woman in society. Among peoples where the women have to work far harder than we think suitable, there is often much more real respect for women than among our Europeans. The lady of civilization, surrounded by false homage and estranged from all real work, has an infinitely lower social position than the hard-working woman of barbarism who was regarded among her people as a real lady, prova, frau, mistress, and who was also a lady in character. Whether pairing marriage has completely supplanted group marriage in America today is a question to be decided by closer investigation among the people still at the upper stage of savagery in the Northwest, and particularly in South America. Among the latter, so many instances of sexual license are related that one can hardly assume the old group marriage to have been completely overcome here. At any rate, all traces of it have not yet disappeared. In at least 40 North American tribes, the man who marries an eldest sister has the right to take all her other sisters as his wives as soon as they are old enough, a relic of the time when a whole line of sisters had husbands in common. And Bancroft reports of the Indians of the California Peninsula, upper stage of savagery, that they have certain festivals when several quote-unquote tribes come together for the purpose of promiscuous sexual intercourse. These quote-unquote tribes are clearly gentes, who preserve in these feasts a dim memory of the time when the women of one gens had all the men of the other as their common husbands, and conversely. The same custom still prevails in Australia. We find among some peoples that the older men, the chieftains and the magician priests, exploit the community of wives and monopolize most of the women for themselves. At certain festivals and great assemblies of the people, however, they have to restore the old community of women and allow their wives to enjoy themselves with the young men. Westermarck, History of Human Marriage, 1891, pages 28 and 29, quotes a whole series of instances of such periodic Saturnalian feasts when for a short time the old freedom of sexual intercourse is again restored. Examples are given among the Hos, the Santals, the Punjas and Kotars in India, among some African peoples, and so forth. Curiously enough, Westermarck draws the conclusion that these are survivals, not of the group marriage, which he totally rejects, but of the mating season, which primitive man had in common with the other animals. Here we come to Bachhofen's fourth great discovery, the widespread transitional form between group marriage and pairing. What Bachhofen represents as a penance for the transgression of the old divine laws, the penance by which the woman purchases the right of chastity, is in fact only a mystical expression of the penance by which the woman buys herself out of the old community of husbands and acquires the right to give herself to one man only. This penance consists in a limited surrender. The Babylonian women had to give themselves once a year in the temple of Melita. Other peoples of Asia Minor sent their girls for years to the temple of Anites, where they had to practice free love with favorites of their own choosing before they were allowed to marry. Similar customs in religious disguise are common to almost all Asiatic peoples between the Mediterranean and the Ganges. The sacrifice of atonement by which the woman purchases her freedom becomes increasingly lighter in course of time, as Bachhofen already noted. Quote, instead of being repeated annually, the offering is made once only. The heterism of the matrons is succeeded by the heterism of the maidens. Heterism during marriage by heterism before marriage. Surrender to all without choice, to surrender to some. Unquote. Among other peoples, the religious disguise is absent. In some cases, among the Thracians, Celts, and others in classical times, many of the original inhabitants of India, and to this day among the Malayan peoples, the South Sea Islanders, and many American Indians, the girls enjoy the greatest sexual freedom up to the time of their marriage. This is especially the case almost everywhere in South America, as everyone who has gone any distance into the interior can testify. Thus, Agassiz, A Journey into Brazil, Boston and New York, 1868, page 266, tells this story of a rich family of Indian extraction. When he was introduced to the daughter, he asked after the father, presuming him to be her mother's husband, who was fighting as an officer in the war against Paraguay, but the mother answered with a smile, quote, "She has no father, she is a child of chance," unquote. But the mother answered with a smile, "She has no father, she is a child of chance." Quote, "It is the way the Indian or half-breed women here always speak of their illegitimate children, without an intonation of sadness or of blame. So far is this from being an unusual case, that the opposite seems the exception. Children are frequently quite ignorant of their parentage. They know about their mother, for all the care and responsibility falls upon her, but they have no knowledge of their father, nor does it seem to occur to the woman that she or her children have any claim upon him." Unquote. What seems strange here to civilized people is simply the rule according to mother right and in group marriage. Among other peoples, again, the friends and relatives of the bridegroom or the wedding guests claim their traditional right to the bride at the wedding itself, and the bridegroom's turn only comes last. This was the custom in the Balearic Islands and among the Algiers of Africa in ancient times. It is still observed among the Barias of Abyssinia. In other cases, an official personage, the head of the tribe or the gens, cacique, shaman, priest, prince, or whatever he may be called, represents the community and exercises the right of the first night with the bride. Despite all the necromantic whitewashing, this jus prime noctis still persists today as a relic of group marriage among most of the natives of the Alaska region. Bancroft, Native Races, Book 1, page 81. The Tahoos of North Mexico, Ibid, page 584, and other peoples. And at any rate in the countries originally Celtic, where it was handed down directly from group marriage, it existed throughout the whole of the Middle Ages, for example in Aragon. While in Castile the peasants were never serfs, in Aragon there was serfdom of the most shameful kind, right up till the decree of Ferdinand the Catholic in 1486. This document states, quote, "We judge and declare that the aforementioned lords, seigneurs, barons, when the peasant takes himself a wife, shall neither sleep with her on the first night, nor shall they during the wedding night. When the wife has laid herself in bed, step over it, and the aforementioned wife as a sign of lordship, nor shall the aforementioned lords use the daughter or the son of the peasant, with payment or without payment, against their will." Unquote. Bachofen is also perfectly right when he consistently maintains that the transition from what he calls heterism or Sumpfzeugung to monogamy was brought about primarily through the women. The more the traditional sexual relations lost the native primitive character of forest life, owing to the development of economic conditions, with consequent undermining of the old communism and growing density of the population, the more oppressive and humiliating must the women have felt them to be, and the greater their longing for the right of chastity, of temporary or permanent marriage with one man only as a way of release. This advance could not in any case have originated with the men, if only because it has never occurred to them, even to this day, to renounce the pleasures of actual group marriage. Only when the women had brought about the transition to pairing marriage were the men able to introduce strict monogamy, though indeed only for women. The first beginnings of the pairing family appear on the dividing line between savagery and barbarism. They are generally to be found already at the upper stage of savagery, but occasionally not until the lower stage of barbarism. The pairing family is the form characteristic of barbarism, as group marriage is characteristic of savagery and monogamy of civilization. To develop it further to strict monogamy, other causes were required than those we have found active hitherto. In the single pair, the group was already reduced to its final unit, its two-atom molecule, one man and one woman. Natural selection, with its progressive exclusion from the marriage community, had accomplished its task. There was nothing more for it to do in this direction, unless new social forces came into play. There was no reason why a new form of family should arise from the single pair, but these new forces did come into play. We now leave America, the classic soil of the pairing family. No sign allows us to conclude that a higher form of family developed here, or that there was ever permanent monogamy anywhere in America prior to its discovery and conquest, but not so in the Old World. Here, the domestication of animals and the breeding of herds had developed a hitherto unsuspected source of wealth and created entirely new social relations. Up to the lower stage of barbarism, permanent wealth had consisted almost solely of house, clothing, food ornaments, and the tools for obtaining and preparing food, boat, weapons, and domestic utensils of the simplest kind. Food had to be won afresh day by day. Now, with their herds of horses, camels, asses, cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, the advancing pastoral peoples, the Semites on the Euphrates and the Tigris, and the Aryans in the Indian country of the five streams, Punjab, in the Ganges region, and in the steppes, then much more abundantly watered, of the Oxus and the Jaxartes, had acquired property which only needed supervision and the rudest care to reproduce itself in steadily increasing quantities, and to supply the most abundant food in the form of milk and meat. All former means of procuring food now receded into the background. Hunting, formerly a necessity, now became a luxury. But to whom did this new wealth belong? Originally to the gents, without a doubt. Private property in herds must have already started at an early period, however. It is difficult to say whether the author of the so-called First Book of Moses regarded the patriarch Abraham as the owner of his herds in his own right as a head of a family community, or by right of his position as actual hereditary head of the gens. What is certain is that we must not think of him as a property owner in the modern sense of the word, and it is also certain that at the threshold of authentic history, we already find the herds everywhere separately owned by heads of families, as are the artistic products of barbarism, metal implements, luxury articles, and finally the human cattle, the slaves. For now, slavery had also been invented. To the barbarian of the lower stage, a slave was valueless. Hence, the treatment of defeated enemies by the American Indians was quite different from that at a higher stage. The men were killed or adopted as brothers into the tribe of the victors. The women were taken as wives or otherwise adopted with their surviving children. At this stage, human labor power still does not produce any considerable surplus over and above its maintenance costs. That was no longer the case after the introduction of cattle breeding, metalworking, weaving, and lastly, agriculture. Just as the wives, whom it had formerly been so easy to obtain, had now acquired an exchange value and were bought, so also with the forces of labor, particularly since the herds had definitely become family possessions. The family did not multiply so rapidly as the cattle. More people were needed to look after them. For this purpose, use could be made of the enemies captured in war, who could also be bred just as easily as the cattle themselves. Once it had passed into the private possession of families, and there rapidly begun to augment, this wealth dealt a severe blow to the society founded on pairing marriage and the matriarchal gens. Pairing marriage had brought a new element into the family. By the side of the natural mother of the child, it placed its natural and attested father with a better warrant of paternity, probably, than that of many a father today. According to the division of labor within the family at that time, it was the man's part to obtain food and the instruments of labor necessary for the purpose. He, therefore, also owned the instruments of labor, and in the event of husband and wife separating, he took them with him, just as she retained her household goods. Therefore, according to the social custom of the time, the man was also the owner of the new source of subsistence, the cattle, and later of the new instruments of labor, the slaves. But according to the custom of the same society, his children could not inherit from him, for as regards inheritance, the position was as follows. At first, according to mother right, so long therefore as descent was reckoned only in the female line, and according to the original custom of inheritance within the gens, the Gentile relatives inherited from a deceased fellow member of their gens. His property had to remain within the gens. His effects being insignificant, they probably always passed in practice to his nearest Gentile relations, that is, to his blood relations on the mother's side. The children of the dead man, however, did not belong to his gens, but to that of their mother. It was from her that they inherited, at first conjointly with her other blood relations, later, perhaps, with rights of priority. They could not inherit from their father, because they did not belong to his gens, within which his property had to remain. When the owner of the herds died, therefore, his herds would go first to his brothers and sisters, and to his sisters' children, or to the issue of his mother's sisters, but his own children were disinherited. Thus, on the one hand, in proportion as wealth increased, it made the man's position in the family more important than the woman's, and on the other hand, created an impulse to exploit his strengthened position in order to overthrow, in favor of his children, the traditional order of inheritance. This, however, was impossible so long as descent was reckoned according to mother right. Mother right, therefore, had to be overthrown, and overthrown it was. This was by no means so difficult as it looks to us today. For this revolution, one of the most decisive ever experienced by humanity, could take place without disturbing a single one of the living members of the gens. All could remain as they were. A simple decree sufficed that in the future the offspring of the male members should remain within the gens, but that of the female should be excluded by being transferred to the gens of their father. The reckoning of descent in the female line and the matriarchal law of inheritance were thereby overthrown, and the male line of descent and the paternal law of inheritance were substituted for them. As to how and when this revolution took place among civilized peoples, we have no knowledge. It falls entirely within prehistoric times, but that it did take place is more than sufficiently proved by the abundant traces of mother right which have been collected, particularly by Bahofen. How easily it is accomplished can be seen in a whole series of American Indian tribes, where it has only recently taken place, and is still taking place, under the influence partly of increasing wealth and a changed mode of life, transference from forest to prairie, and partly of the moral pressure of civilization and missionaries. Of 8 Missouri tribes, 6 observed the male line of descent and inheritance. 2 still observe the female. Among the Shawnees, Miamis, and Delawares, the custom has grown up of giving the children a Gentile name of their father's gens in order to transfer them into it, thus enabling them to inherit from him. Quote, man's innate casuistry to change things by changing their names, and to find loopholes for violating tradition while maintaining tradition, when direct interest supplied sufficient impulse, unquote. Marx. The result was hopeless confusion, which could only be remedied, and to a certain extent was remedied, by the transition to father right. Quote, in general, this seems to be the most natural transition, unquote. Marx. For the theories proffered by comparative jurisprudence regarding the manner in which this change was effected among the civilized peoples of the Old World, though they are almost pure hypotheses, see M. Kovalevsky, Tableau des origines et de l'évolution de la famille et de la propriété, Stockholm, 1890. The overthrow of mother right was the world historical defeat of the female sex. The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. This degraded position of the woman, especially conspicuous among the Greeks of the heroic and still more of the classical age, has gradually been palliated and glazed over, and sometimes clothed in a milder form. In no sense has it been abolished. Quote, the establishment of the exclusive supremacy of the man shows its effects first in the patriarchal family, which now emerges as an intermediate form. Its essential characteristic is not polygyny, of which more later, but the organization of a number of persons, bond and free, into a family under paternal power for the purpose of holding lands and for the care of flocks and herds. In the Semitic form, the chiefs at least lived in polygamy. Those held to servitude and those employed as servants lived under the marriage relation. Unquote. Its essential features are the incorporation of unfree persons and paternal power. Hence, the perfect type of this form of family is the Roman. The original meaning of the word family, familia, is not that compound of sentimentality and domestic strife which forms the ideal of the present-day Philistine. Among the Romans, it did not at first even refer to the married pair and their children, but only to the slaves. Famulus means domestic slave, and familia is the total number of slaves belonging to one man. As late as the time of Gaius, the familia, id est patrimonium, family, that is, the patrimony, the inheritance, was bequeathed by will. The term was invented by the Romans to denote a new social organism, whose head ruled over wife and children and a number of slaves, and was invested under Roman paternal power with rights of life and death over them all. Quote, this term, therefore, is no older than the ironclad system of the Latin tribes, which came in after field agriculture and after legalized servitude, as well as after the separation of Greeks and Latins. Unquote. Marx adds, quote, the modern family contains in germ not only slavery, servitus, but also serfdom, since from the beginning it is related to agricultural services. It contains in miniature all the contradictions which later extended throughout society and its state. Unquote. Such a form of family shows the transition of the pairing family to monogamy. In order to make certain of the wife's fidelity and therefore of the paternity of the children, she is delivered over unconditionally into the power of the husband. If he kills her, he is only exercising his rights. With the patriarchal family, we enter the field of written history, a field where comparative jurisprudence can give valuable help, and it has in fact brought an important advance in our knowledge. We owe to Maxim Kovalevsky, Tableau, etc., De la Mine et de Propriété, Stockholm, 1890, pages 60 to 100, the proof that the patriarchal household community, as we still find it today among the Serbs and the Bulgars, under the name Zadruga, which may be roughly translated, quote-unquote, bond of friendship, or bratstvo, brotherhood, and in a modified form among the Oriental peoples, formed the transitional stage between the matriarchal family, deriving from group marriage, and the single family of the modern world. For the civilized peoples of the Old World, for the Aryans and Semites at any rate, this seems to be established. The southern Slav, Zadruga, provides the best instance of such a family community still in actual existence. It comprises several generations of the descendants of one father, together with their wives, who all live together in one homestead, cultivate their fields in common, feed and clothe themselves from a common stock, and possess in common the surplus from their labor. The community is under the supreme direction of the head of the house, Domasin, who acts as the representative outside, has the rights to sell minor objects, and controls the funds, for which, as for the regular organization of business, he is responsible. He is elected, and it is not at all necessary that he should be the oldest in the community. The women and their work are under the control of the mistress of the house, Damasika, who is generally the wife of the Damasin. She also has an important and often a decisive voice in the choice of husbands for the girls. Supreme power rests, however, with the family council, the assembly of all adult members of the household, women as well as men. To this assembly, the master of the house renders account. It takes all important decisions, exercises jurisdiction over the members, decides on sales and purchases of any importance, especially of land, and so on. It is only within the last 10 years or so that such great family communities have been proved to still be in existence in Russia. It is now generally recognized that they are as firmly rooted in the customs of the Russian people as the община or village community. They appear in the oldest Russian code of laws, the Pravda of Yaroslav, under the same name as in the Dalmatian laws, Verged, and references to them can also be traced in Polish and Czech historical sources. Among the Germans also, according to Häusler, Institutionen des deutschen Rechts, the economic unit was originally not a single family in the modern sense, but a quote-unquote house community, which consisted of several generations or several single families, and often enough included unfree persons as well. The Roman family is now also considered to have originated from this type, and consequently the absolute power of the father of the house and the complete absence of rights among the other members of the family in relation to him have recently been strongly questioned. It is supposed that similar family communities also existed among the Celts in Ireland. In France, under the name of Parfeneries, they survived in Nivernais until the French Revolution, and in the French Comté, they have not completely died out even today. In the district of Loans, Seine-et-Loire, large peasant houses can be seen in which live several generations of the same family. The house has a lofty common hall reaching to the roof, and surrounding it the sleeping rooms, to which stairs of 6 or 8 steps give access. In India, the household community with common cultivation of the land is already mentioned by Nearchus in the time of Alexander the Great, and it still exists today in the same region, in the Punjab and the whole northwest India. Kovalevsky was himself able to prove its existence in the Caucasus. In Algeria, it survives among the Kabyles. It is supposed to have occurred even in America, and the Calpolis, which Zurita describes in Old Mexico, have been identified with it. On the other hand, Kuno has proved fairly clearly in the journal Ausland, 1890, numbers 42 to 44, that in Peru at the time of the conquest, there was a form of constitution based on marks, called curiously enough marca, with periodical allotment of arable land, and consequently with individual tillage. In any case, the patriarchal household community with common ownership and common cultivation of the land now assumes an entirely different significance than hitherto. We can no longer doubt the important part it played as a transitional form between the matriarchal family and the single family among civilized and other peoples of the old world. Later, we will return to the further conclusion drawn by Kovalevsky that it was also the transitional form out of which developed the village or mark community with individual tillage and the allotment, first periodical and then permanent, of arable and pasture land. With regard to the family life within these communities, it must be observed that at any rate in Russia, the master of the house has a reputation for violently abusing his position towards the younger women of the community, especially his daughters-in-law, whom he often converts into his harem. The Russian folk songs have more than a little to say about this. Before we go on to monogamy, which developed rapidly with the overthrow of mother right, a few words about polygyny and polyandry. Both forms can only be exceptions, historical luxury products, as it were, unless they occur side by side in the same country, which is, of course, not the case. As the men excluded from polygyny cannot console themselves with the women left over from polyandry, and as hitherto, Regardless of social institutions, the number of men and women has been fairly equal. It is obviously impossible for either of these forms of marriage to be elevated to the general form. Polygyny on the part of one individual man was, in fact, obviously a product of slavery and confined to a few people in exceptional positions. In the Semitic patriarchal family, it was only the patriarch himself and a few of his sons at most who lived in polygyny. The rest had to content themselves with one wife. This still holds throughout the whole of the Orient. Polygyny is the privilege of the wealthy and of the nobility, the women being recruited chiefly through purchase as slaves. The mass of the people live in monogamy. A similar exception is the polyandry of India and Tibet, the origin of which in group marriage requires closer examination and would certainly prove interesting. It seems to be much more easygoing in practice than the jealous harems of the Mohammedans. At any rate, among the Nairs in India, where 3 or 4 men have a wife in common, each of them can have a second wife in common with another 3 or more men, and similarly a third and a fourth, and so on. It is a wonder that MacLennan did not discover in these marriage clubs, to several of which one could belong and which he himself describes, a new class of club marriage.
So we'll come back to this tomorrow. We've been listening to The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State by Frederick Engles. My name's Dan Baker. I am a member of the Revolutionary Communists of America, and I am a combat veteran of the YPG International, which is a socialist militia in the autonomous zone of Rojava in northeast Syria. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow.